What if every child in Westeros was fostered in the north with Ned Stark? Ned Stark learns the truth about Cersei's children when Joffrey is 11. He says nothing for 5 more years. Not because he's weak, because the boy he raised is the beloved brother of every heir in Westeros, and the truth would tear apart the only peace anyone's ever built. That's not honor. That's the thing honor was supposed to protect. Let's get into it. The wine had been flowing since noon, and by the time the candles burned to stubs, Robert Baratheon had stopped cursing the Iron Islands and started remembering the Vale. Balin Greyjoy. He turned the name over like a stone he meant to throw. You know why he did it, Jon? Not for a crown, not for salt and rock. He filled his own cup, waving off the boy who leaned in to do it for him. Because he never once broke bread with a man who wasn't Kraken-born. Never sat at another lord's table. A man like that can burn the realm to the waterline and not feel the heat. Because to him, it was never one thing. It was an island. Strangers he was owed. Jon Arryn said nothing. He had learned across 2 decades that Robert's memories were most dangerous when they turned fond. The eerie, softer now, almost wondering. You beat the manners into us with that God's damned wooden spoon, and we hated you, and by spring we'd have died for each other. Ned Stark is closer to me than my own brother, Jon, and I met a frightened boy in your hall. He pointed a thick finger across the table. That wasn't blood. Blood didn't do that. You did. The old man set his cup down very carefully, because he had heard the shape of a decision forming in the king's chest, and he did not yet know its size. Every lord in this realm, Robert said, would rather cut a rival's throat than learn his name. So we teach them the name first. He stood, unsteady, radiant with it. The children, all of them, sent north the year they turned 6, raised under Ned Stark till they're 16, and can't remember a time they weren't brothers. That night he dictated it, and it was madness and genius in the same breath. Jon Arryn tried the only wall he had. The crown cannot compel a great lord to give up his heir, your grace. Tywin will refuse. Doran will smile and delay 10 years. I'm not compelling anyone. Robert grinned through the wine, and for one moment the boy who had won a kingdom looked out of the ruined face. I'm asking all of them at once. Which lord wants to be the only house that said no? The only man in Westeros with something to hide behind his walls, standing alone while every other banner sends its blood to prove its loyalty. He belched. Nobody's that brave, not even Tywin Bloody Lannister. Jon Arryn felt the chill come up through the stone floor. It was the most cunning thing Robert had ever conceived. A cage with no bars, only the fear of being the last one outside it. And the king had stumbled into it drunk, and would never once understand what he had built. Cersei found the sealed proclamation before the ravens flew. She came to the king's chambers white to the lips, and she did not argue policy, because policy was Jon Arryn's language,
and she had a better one. "You mean to take my son to a tomb at the end of the world," she said, "and hand him to a Stark to raise. My son! Do you hear the words as you say them?" Robert did not look up from his cup. "He'll thank me for it. Ned Stark will make a man of him, a better man than either of us managed to be. He is 6 years old."
So was I, near enough, when John took me in. He waved her toward the door, as one waves off a fly. "You've smothered the boy till he's soft. The North will fix that." She stood a moment longer, and something behind her eyes finished its arithmetic and went still. She would not scream again. Screaming was for women who thought the argument could be won in this room. When she walked out, she was already composing in the cold, clean room at the back of her mind, the first of 13 years of letters, the poison she would send north, drop by drop, moon by moon, for as long as it took to remind her son whose blood he carried. Behind her, in the rookery, the maesters were sealing the last of the little scrolls. The ravens went out into the dark before dawn, for Highgarden and Casterly Rock and Sunspear and Riverrun, carrying a king's whim that no house would dare be the first to refuse. And none of the men bending over the birds had any notion that the realm had just changed hands, without a single sword being drawn. The bird reached Winterfell in a grey dawn, and Ned Stark read the king's decree twice before he reached for a fresh quill to decline it. He was a warden and a soldier. He had a keep to hold, a wall to watch, a boy to keep alive at the edge of the world. He was not a master of some Southron academy, and he would tell Robert so in plain words. His friend could not make a mistake. Catelyn stopped him with one sentence, spoken while she still had the letter in her hand. "If you refuse, he will only send them to whoever says yes." She set it down, and whoever says yes will do it because they want what comes with them. Ned, every heir in Westeros under one roof. Would you rather that roof were yours or Tywin Lannister's? He looked at the quill for a long moment. Outside the narrow window, the snow was coming down over the yard, where his own sons were already too many for one man to watch. And now the king meant to give him the whole of Westeros besides. "I am not the man for this," he said, and it was not an argument any longer, only the truth spoken aloud. "No man is," Catelyn answered. "That is why it must be a man who does not want it." She touched his shoulder once. "Robert chose you because you will not use them. Anyone who would jump at this is exactly the wrong hands to put them in." He put the quill down. It cost him something to do, though nothing showed on his face. The Tyrells came first. Olenna sent Loras and Marjorie gladly, and did not pretend otherwise. Her letter was 3 lines long, and entirely without shame. Her grandchildren would be raised beside the future of every great house, and any grandmother who called that a burden was a fool who did not deserve grandchildren. Ned read it twice, and something in him almost admired the honesty of it. The two of them came down out of the wheelhouse into the cold, like a pair of songbirds shaken loose in a snowstorm. Loras all curls and outrage at the weather. Marjorie already smiling at the servants, as though she owned them and meant to be kind about it. Ned watched from the steps and understood in a glance that Olenna had trained these children the way another woman might train falcons.
Theon Greyjoy watched them too, from the battlements, arms folded and mouth set hard. He had come to Winterfell a hostage against his father's good behavior, the boy whose neck Ned Stark would open if Balon ever raised the Kraken again. And for 2 years he had carried that knowledge like a stone under his tongue. He watched the Tyrell children cross the yard. He thought of the Riverlands boys expected before the thaw, and the Rock's prince after them, and the rest of the realm's blood filing in behind. And slowly a different truth settled into him, warm and strange. He was not the only hostage in this castle. He was only the first. A man who is one among many is not marked for the block.
He is simply a boy among boys, and for the space of a breath, up there in the wind, Theon Greyjoy let himself feel something he had not permitted in 2 years, which was hope. Robb, 7 and grave with the weight his father had laid on him, had been told to make no distinction between any child who came through the gate. He tried. He did not entirely manage it. He gave Theon the older brother's deference of a Stark to a guest, and he gave the Tyrell boy a hard measuring look that a lord's son gives a rival. But he tried, and Ned watched him try, and said nothing, which from Ned Stark was a kind of pride. By winter's end, nearly every great house had answered. Tully pledged the children Catelyn's brother would one day sire. Tyrell had already sent theirs. Martell answered with a courtesy so smooth it promised delay. The Rock sent word that the prince would come the year he turned 6, in language Tywin had clearly dictated to sound like obedience and mean something else. Only the Vale said nothing. Ned waited a month, then 2, then wrote to Jon Arryn himself, not to the Lord of the Vale, but to the man who had raised him, plainly one foster son to another. Where are your ward's children? Where is the Vale? The answer, when it came, was not the crisp hand of the king. It was shaky, and it wandered, and it was ashamed. John Aaron wrote of duty, and of Robert's will, and of his own inability to enforce either under his own roof. And near the end of it, he wrote a name Ned had not expected to see. Lysa will not part with the child she has not yet even carried. I cannot make her. Forgive me, boy. Ned read his foster father's tremor in every line, and read Lysa's refusal folded inside the apology like a splinter under skin. Every other house in the realm had bent to the fear of being the last one standing alone. Only the Vale had chosen to stand there. He did not know why. He only knew, standing in the cold of his solar, with the letter in his hand, that the thing Robert had built had a crack in it already, and that he could not see the bottom of it. 2 years the crack stayed narrow and quiet, and then the decree came for the child Robert most wanted fixed, and Cersei Lannister rode the length of the King's Road to deliver him herself. She would not send Joffrey with an escort like a parcel. She came the whole way, and every night of that long, cold road she taught her son the same lesson, wearing a different face. By firelight, in a wayside inn, she told him of the rock, of gold and lions, of the men who had knelt to his grandfather, and the men who had died for not kneeling fast enough. In the swaying dark of the wheelhouse, she named the lords of the north to him, one by one. Small men, she said, cold men, men who lived among wolves because no finer folk would have them. And on the last night, with the walls of Winterfell somewhere out in the snow ahead, she took his chin in her hand and gave him the whole of it in 3 sentences. These people are beneath you. They will resent you for what you are, and they will try to make you small. You must never once let them. By the time the wheelhouse rolled under Winterfell's gate, the boy was 6 years old and armored head to foot in contempt. He found Robb Stark in the yard within the hour, and informed him, in a clear, carrying voice, that a prince outranked a warden's son, and would be addressed as such henceforth. Robb was 9. He looked at the golden child for a long moment, and then he said nothing at all, turned back to the practice sword in his hand, and went on with his work. It was worse than any answer. Joffrey had been braced for outrage, for a blow, for anything he could stand upon. He got silent and did not know what to do with it. Cersei lingered for a full moon's turn. She undermined Ned at every meal. A word here about northern manners, a remark there about the cold, the food, the crudeness of it all. Each one aimed past her host and into the ear of her son. Ned bore it with a patience that gave her nothing to strive for. It ended only when a raven came from Robert, ordering her south in language that left no room for a queen's discretion. On the morning she left, she knelt in the snow of the yard, heedless of her skirts, and took Joffrey's face in her gloved hands. "You are a lion," she told him. "Lions do not kneel. Lions do not thank. Whatever they teach you here, whatever they take from you, you remember what you are, and you remember that I am coming for you." She kissed his brow. "I will come for you." It was the last time she would ever hold his ear for more than the length of a letter, and she spent it planting a single seed that she would spend the next 13 years trying to keep alive from 1,000 miles away. The carriage went down the King's Road before the frost lifted. Ned Stark came to the boy's chamber at dawn the next morning. "Dress," he said. "You're wanted in the yard." Joffrey did not move from the bed. "I don't train with servants' sons. My father is the king. My mother is a Lannister of Casterly Rock. You will send my breakfast up, and you will not come into my room again without leave." Ned did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He stood in the doorway with the gray morning behind him and said evenly, "In this castle, a boy who will not train does not eat." And then he closed the door and walked away. Joffrey sat in the cold and waited for the world to right itself. He waited for a knock. He waited for a tray carried up in secret, for a frightened servant, for the door to open and someone to undo it, because someone had always come, all his life, to undo the things he did not like. His mother had made a kingdom of that certainty and left him standing in the middle of it. The light climbed the wall. Noon came and went. His belly turned over, and he told himself it did not matter, that they would break before he did, that Ned Stark could not truly mean to let a prince of the realm go hungry in his own guest chamber. Evening came gray to the window. No one climbed the stairs. For the first time in his short and gilded life, a word he hated had been said to him, plainly and without heat, and then nothing whatsoever had happened afterward. No scene, no punishment, no rescue, nothing at all. And the silence that followed it was the loudest thing the boy had ever heard. By the third day, the boy had not eaten, and the war of wills had gone somewhere colder. Hungry, sleepless, humiliated by a hunger no one would end for him, Joffrey went looking through the castle for the one thing that had never once failed him. Something smaller than himself that he could hurt. They found the cat in the godswood. It had been heavy with kittens. Its belly had been opened with something small and sharp, and it had not died quickly. Joffrey did not deny it. That was the part that undid the room. He explained it, brightly, helpfully, as a boy explains a clever thing he has done, that he had wanted to see what was inside, and now he had seen. Catelyn wanted him whipped bloody. Sir Roderick wanted him packed onto a horse and sent back to his mother before he did worse. Maester Luwin said little, and what he said was the worst of all, that the boy spoke of it without heat, without rage, without even cruelty, as a man understood cruelty, that he described it the way another child might describe opening a walnut. Curiosity, not fury, which meant a whipping would teach him nothing at all, except that the world hurt back when you were caught. Ned listened to every one of them and did none of it. He took Joffrey to the Godswood himself, in the failing light, and put a spade in his hands. "You'll bury her," he said, "in this ground, now, alone, however long it takes." The earth was frozen a foot down, and the boy wept and raged and swore and dug, and Ned stood at the edge of the trees with his arms folded and did not lift a finger to help, and the grave took until full dark. When it was filled, Ned gave him his sentence. "The kennels are yours, a year. Every dog in Winterfell. You'll feed them, you'll clean their filth, you'll sit with the bitches when they whelp." He crouched to the boy's level in the snow. Any fool can end a life. It's the easiest thing there is. The only thing worth measuring a man by is what he can keep alive. "When I am king," Joffrey screamed at him, shaking, filthy, "I will have your head. I'll have it on a spike over your own gate." "You may," Ned said, and stood. "But not tonight. Tonight the dogs still need feeding." 9 moons the boy served in the kennels and hated it, and grew into it without noticing. He hated the stink and the cold and the mucking out worst of all, and he told the dogs so, at length, every morning. But dogs do not care what a prince thinks of them. They care who fills the trough, and by midwinter every hound in Winterfell knew Joffrey's step on the straw and rose to meet it. He learned their names before he meant to. He learned which bitch would take food from his hand and which would sooner take the hand, and somewhere in the learning the work stopped being a punishment and became simply the thing he did, though he would have died before admitting it to Ned Stark. Then came a black night in the dead of winter, when a hound went into a hard, wrong labor, and there was no one in the kennels but Joffrey. He shouted for the kennel master, and no one came through the snow. The bitch strained and screamed, and something was wrong. The first pup came sideways and stuck, and the mother's eyes rolled white, and for one terrible stretch, it looked as though he would lose every one of them, and the mother too, and it would be his fault, and no one would even know to blame him. His hands shook. He nearly ran. He very nearly left them to die in the straw, the way he had left the cat, because that was easy, and this was not. He did not run. Filthy to the elbow, weeping with fury and terror both, he reached in and turned the pup the way he'd watched the kennel master do it, and pulled, and it came and breathed. Then the next, and the next. 6 pups he brought squalling into the world before dawn. The 7th he could not save. It came still and blue, and he held it a long time in the lamplight, not understanding why his chest hurt so. He carried the dead one out into the gray first light to bury it, and stopped. Ned Stark was standing in the snow outside the open kennel door. He had been there all night. He had watched the whole of it through the doorway and never once came in. "Well done," Ned said. And Joffrey Baratheon, who had been promised the world since the hour of his birth, burst into tears he could not begin to understand, because in 6 years of life, no one had ever said those 2 words to him and meant them, and he had no idea what to do with a thing he had wanted this badly without ever knowing its name. He wanted it again. That was the trouble. He wanted Ned Stark to say it again, and he had no earthly idea how to earn it, except the only way he understood: by being better than every boy in the yard. The yard did not care that he was a prince. Sir Roderick ran it as a rough kind of democracy where rank meant nothing and reach meant everything. And Joffrey, small for his age, quick, ferociously proud, was put in the mud daily. Robb hammered him with a patient older brother thoroughness that was almost worse than cruelty. Theon knocked his feet from under him for the sport of it and grinned while he did it. Worst of all was the Tyrell boy. Loras was 2 years his junior and already better with a blade than anyone north of the neck, and he moved like water while Joffrey hacked like a woodcutter. 11 times in a single gray afternoon the smaller boy put him down. The 10th time, Joffrey came up swinging in a blind fury and nearly caught him. Nearly. For one bright half-second, the prince saw the opening and lunged and thought, now I have him. And Loras simply was not where the sword went. And the 11th fall was harder than all the ones before it, because that one Joffrey had believed he would win. On the 12th pass, Loras knocked him flat again, and then, unbearably, held out a hand to help him up. Joffrey looked at the hand the way he'd once looked at the closed door of his chamber. Every lesson his mother had ever given him said to strike it away. He lay in the freezing muck and hated the boy, and hated the hand, and hated that he wanted to take it. And then he took it. It was the beginning of the only true friendship Joffrey Baratheon would ever have in his life, and neither boy knew it, and Sir Roderick only barked at them to get back to their marks. Theon was changing too, in a quieter way. He had come to Winterfell braced to die a hostage, sneering at everything so that nothing could reach him first. But in a castle filled with wards, he found he was no longer the marked man. He was simply the eldest. And being the eldest turned out to be a thing he was unexpectedly good at. He taught the younger boys the bow, which was his one true gift. and there was a plain, warm pleasure in it he had not expected. In the small Tully cousin finally sinking an arrow into the straw and turning round with his whole face lit up. He led midnight raids on old Nan's kitchen for honey cakes, and took the blame himself when Sir Roderick caught them at it. The sneer fell away without him ever noticing it go, because no one in this yard was looking down on him. And a boy cannot go on sneering at people who are laughing at his jokes. Ned watched the Greyjoy lad shouting corrections down the archery line at a Tyrell and a Tully both, and said nothing about it, which was how Ned Stark said most of the things that mattered to him. Then a raven came from King's Landing, and it came for Joffrey alone. It was his mother's letter, the monthly one, and it was poison poured neat. The Starks keep you a prisoner and call it fostering. They mean to make you forget the rock and the crown and the woman who bore you. No one there loves you. How could they? You are a lion among dogs. Remember who you are. Remember, I am coming. Joffrey read it standing at the great hearth in the hall, while the evening meal went on behind him. He read it once. Then he looked across the long room at Ned Stark at the head of the table, carving trenchers, hearing out a steward's complaint, ordinary and gray and present. And he looked back down at his mother's beautiful, furious hand. He dropped the letter into the fire without reaching the end of it, and watched it curl to ash, and then he went and sat down to eat. 1,000 miles south, 1 moon later, Cersei Lannister broke the seal on the reply she had waited a year of moons to receive, and found nothing inside. No answer, not a line. For the first time since she had knelt in the snow and told her son what he was, the raven had come back empty. She sat with the blank parchment for a long while, and somewhere behind the green cold of her eyes, a woman who had lost her firstborn to a frozen tomb at the end of the world began, very quietly and with no particular haste, to consider precisely what a mother might be willing to do to take her son back from a man who had stolen him without once laying a hand upon him. Cersei did not ride north the second time. She told the court it was the roads, the season, a queen's 100 duties. She told herself nothing at all, because the truth would not survive being spoken, that she could not sit in a wheelhouse for a month with her daughter's small, warm hand in hers, and deliver that child, too, into the keeping of the man who had already swallowed her son. She could not cross 1,000 miles of cold to look at Eddard Stark's gray, unmoving face across a hall and thank him for what he was doing to her family. So Myrcella went north, with a column of Lannister guards and a nervous septa, and arrived at Winterfell, frightened nearly to tears. 6 years old, certain the cold would eat her before spring. She was met at the gate, Sansa Stark, and Marjorie Tyrell had been planning the welcome for a month. Which chamber the little southern girl would sleep in? Which of them would sit at her either hand? How they would take her first to the glass gardens, where things still grew green under the snow. 10 and 13, and already formidable, the two of them folded the small Lannister into their orbit before her boots were even dry, and by nightfall Myrcella had stopped shivering and started asking questions, and the Septa, who had braced for a year of homesick weeping, found she had nothing left to do. Tommen followed the next year, and fastened himself to Joffrey the way ivy fastens to stone, wholly and for good. Joffrey had no notion what to do with it at first. Then, to his own bewilderment, he discovered that he did, and that he liked it. The small brother trailing him to the yard, watching him spar, believing every word out of his mouth. Being looked up to was a thing no one had ever prepared him for. It turned out to be far better than being feared. Word of all this reached Casterly Rock, and Tywin Lannister did the arithmetic and did not care for the sum. 3 of his grandchildren now slept 1,000 miles away beneath Eddard Stark's roof, which meant that every stroke he might make against a rival house, every debt called in, every betrothal shattered, every quiet blade in a dark corridor, was now a stroke aimed squarely at a keep that held his own blood. A lion does not spring while its cubs sit in the other beast's jaws. He wrote to Cersei that they must be patient, that their day would come, that nothing was truly lost, which was the nearest thing to a confession Tywin Lannister would ever set down, that he had been fought to a standstill by a fat drunkard who could not balance his own ledgers. He did not write the other thought. He did not write that Robert Baratheon had, with no design whatsoever, stumbled into the most perfect hostage system in the history of the 7 kingdoms. Every great house's future gathered under one roof, each child a surety against every other lord's ambition, and not a single sword raised to arrange it. Tywin had spent a lifetime assembling such leverage, a painstaking piece at a time. Robert had achieved it drunk, by accident, and called it Fond Memories of the Vale. The harvest feast that year filled the great hall to the rafters. Ned sat at the head of it, as he had 100 times before, and let his gaze travel the length of the tables, and it caught. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were bent together over some private joke. 3 heads of the same impossible gold burning in the torchlight, laughing at nothing the way children do. Something snagged at the very back of Ned Stark's mind, quiet and small as a splinter, and he could put no name to it, and he did not chase it. He had learned long ago to let lie the things he could not name. Later, when the hall had emptied and the fires burned low, he found himself in the library without quite having decided to go there. He stood a long while before the tapestry of his own line, direwolf gray, all of it, 3 centuries of unbroken gray, and could not have said what he was looking for or why. Down the corridor in the rookery, a raven came in from the eyrie with snow still crusted on its wings. The maester unrolled the little scroll and read it twice before he was sure it was glad tidings. Lysa Arryn, who had lost babe after babe, who had nearly died 6 times in the trying, had at last borne her lord a living son. Far to the south, in the green shade of the water gardens, a different raven had been waiting years for its answer, and Doran Martell could put it off no longer. He had let the decree sit for 6 years, meeting each of the crown's reminders with the perfect courtesy of a man who fully intends to comply the very instant it becomes impossible not to. That instant had arrived.
He gave the order from his chair beside the pool, his gouty feet swaddled against a chill that never came to Dorne, in the same mild voice he used for everything under the sun. Oberyn heard it and called it surrender, and went on calling it surrender for the better part of an hour, that they were sending a boy of the blood of Nymeria to grovel in the snow beside the grandchildren of the man who had ordered Elia and her babes butchered on a Lannister's word. That Doran had at last discovered a way to lose that did not even carry the dignity of a war. Doran let his brother spend himself. Then he answered, unhurried. A Martell raised in Winterfell was a Martell no Lannister hand could ever reach, and a Martell who grew to manhood at the same table as Tywin's own grandchildren was a knife that took 15 years to sharpen and could be drawn in a single afternoon. You want your vengeance in the summer, he told Oberyn. I have wanted it every day for 13 years.
Dorne can wait 15 more. We have always been the patient ones. Oberyn spat that patience was a coward's word for surrender and left the gardens, and Doran did not call him back. What Doran had not planned for was Myrcella. Trystane came north braced for a castle full of enemies, a small dark boy among wolves and lions, ready to hate everything the moment he saw it. What he found instead was a Lannister girl, only a little older than himself, who wanted urgently to know whether it was true that oranges grew on trees in Dorne, and whether he had ever eaten one warm off the branch, and who then seized him by the sleeve to show him the hot springs steaming beneath the snow, because she had decided on no evidence whatever that a Dornish boy must surely be freezing. Within 2 years, the child sent to nurse a blood grudge could not clearly recall what the grudge had been. His letters home stopped naming the Lannisters as anything but people he happened to know, and began to mention, with a frequency that grew alarming, a girl. Oberyn read those letters aloud to Ilaria with a mounting horror that curdled slowly into something close to grief. Doran read the same letters alone and set them down without a word, and not even Oberyn, who had known him from the cradle, could say whether his brother was mourning a vengeance dissolving in his hands, or was, quietly and terribly, satisfied. 1,000 leagues north and east, in King's Landing, Peter Baelish sat with a cup of arbor gold and took stock of the realm, and did not like his accounts. The Tyrells would never move against the Lannisters. Their golden loris called the Lannister prince his brother, and meant every syllable of it. Dorne's ancient wound was being sewn shut by a girl of 9 who liked oranges. Every whisper he let fall into a waiting ear came back stillborn, because there was no longer a soul in Westeros willing to believe the worst of anyone else. The great houses had all grown up in the same yard, bled in the same mud, and a man cannot sell a lord his neighbor's treachery when the two of them once learned to swim in the same hot spring. Chaos was a ladder. It had always been his ladder, the one true faith of Peter Baelish's life. And Eddard Stark, without appearing to notice him even once, had walked quietly up it and torn out every rung as he went. Baelish sat a long time, with the wine going warm and untasted in his hand. Then he rose and crossed to the great map on the wall, and let his eyes climb north, past the trident, past the neck, into the cold, blank silences of the north, and then west to the mountains, to the single sigil in all the 7 kingdoms that had never once sent its children to Winterfell. For the first time in his life, Peter Baelish began to think, seriously and slowly, about the Vale. The letter Jon Arryn sent to Winterfell that spring was in his own hand, and it was ashamed of itself from the very first line. His son would not be coming, not at 6, not ever. Lisa would not permit it, and he, Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, who had raised 2 frightened boys into the men who won a kingdom, could not find it in himself to tear a child from a mother who had buried babe after babe, and near followed each of them into the grave to get this one living son. He set it down plainly and made no excuse for it, and asked Ned's forgiveness for the crack he was putting into a thing he had helped to raise. Ned read it in his solar, and felt no anger, only pity. He remembered Lisa Tully as she had been at Riverrun, a soft, laughing girl, before the marriage and the miscarriages and the long gray years had ground her down to whatever she was now. And the pity was deep and entirely useless. Robert felt otherwise. When they finally brought him the news, he came out of his chair, bellowing that he would send 20 men up the mountain and have the boy carried down to Winterfell in a sack, that no mewling Tully fishwife would make a liar of his decree before the whole assembled realm. It took Jon Arryn the entirety of one night to talk him back down. Patient and bone-weary, reaching for every old loyalty he had left to reach for. In the end, it was not law that moved Robert, nor pride, but a single memory the old man laid before him. How Lysa had wept at her own wedding, and whose wars had made that wedding, and whose bannermen had been paid for in her miscarriages. Robert went quiet at that, and drank, and let it lie. It was the last true service the old man would ever render the crown he had spent his life holding upright. The trouble was that the lords noticed. If the Vale could refuse and keep its heir, then the great unity fostering was not iron law at all, but merely custom. And custom, as every lord in Westeros understood in his bones, was a thing that could be tested, bent, and one fine morning broken outright. A lord in the Stormlands wrote to a lord in the Reach to ask, delicately, what the other made of it. A Frey remarked at his own table that a decree with one exception in it was a decree with a hole in it. And old Walder Frey had spent a long life finding the holes in things. Most of them merely filed the thought away against a later season. One man did not. Peter Baelish began once more to write to Lysa Arryn, gently, sympathetically, an old friend from her father's hall, sick at heart to hear how the cruel, cold men of the realm would rip her only child from her arms. For, of course, no mother should be made to surrender her son. Of course, she was right to keep the boy close. Of course. Of course. It cost Baelish nothing whatsoever, and across 100 lonely leagues it made him the only friend the Lady of the Eyrie believed she had left in all the world. Jon Arryn, meanwhile, had a son he could not send, a wife he could not govern, and a court that had begun to bore him past all bearing. So the old man went looking for something useful to do with the last of himself, and found it in the dusty dark of the royal archives, an ancient book of lineages, and a small, idle question he had somehow never once thought to ask in all his long years, about the color of a Baratheon's hair. It had started as nothing, a remark of Robert's about his brothers, an idle glance at the Golden Prince, a thing that would not quite sit still in an old man's mind. He began to read. He traced the black-haired stags back 300 years, marriage by marriage. Baratheon wed to Lannister, Baratheon wed to Tyrell. Stag joined to every golden house in the realm. And every single time, in every generation, the black won. The black always won. Lord Steffen's children, black. His father's, black. Back and back to Orys himself, black upon black, a river of dark heads with never a gold one bobbing in it, until 3, all at once, in a single generation, under a single mother. He wrote down what he had found in a careful hand.
Then he set the quill aside and sat very still in the guttering candlelight for a long, long while. Because the 3 golden children the arithmetic pointed at were not close by in King's Landing, where a careful man might weigh slowly and safely what ought to be done. They were 1,000 miles north, laughing in a warm hall in the keeping of Eddard Stark. Knowing it was one thing. Deciding what a man could possibly do with the knowledge was another, and it kept Jon Arryn from his sleep a great many nights. In another, colder, simpler realm than the one Robert had drunkenly built, this truth would have been a sword, clean and terrible. The queen's children were bastards, born of incest. The boy who would sit the Iron Throne had no right to it, and an honest man had only to stand and say so, and let justice fall where it must. But this was not that realm. Here, Joffrey was not merely Cersei Lannister's son. He was the foster brother of every heir in Westeros. The boy Robb Stark had wrestled in the mud, whom Loras Tyrell had taught the sword, whom Trystane Martell now called friend. To rise in the throne room and name him bastard would not turn the realm against the Lannisters. It would turn the realm against itself, half the great houses drawing steel for the boy they had grown up beside. The truth was no longer a sword. It was a lit torch, and all of Westeros was a granary. So Jon Arryn did not go to Robert. Robert would kill every one of them before the wine wore off, and weep over it afterward, and never once grasp what he had shattered. He went instead to the only man in the 7 kingdoms who would care for the law more than he feared the cost of it. Stannis Baratheon heard him out in the cold stone of Dragonstone, and was on his feet before the old man had finished, ready to take ship for King's Landing that very hour and speak the thing aloud before gods and men.
To Stannis it was simple, as everything true was simple. The crown was his, by right of law, the moment the boy was proven no Baratheon. And a right was a right, whether it burned the realm or not. Jon Arryn stopped him with the one argument that could reach Stannis, that a truth spoken without complete and unassailable proof was worse than a lie, for it could be denied, and a thing once denied could never afterward be proven. You will get one chance to say this, the old man told him. One. Say it too soon, and Cersei buries the evidence, and you with it, and the boy dies king. They would gather it properly, all of it, the lineage book, the smith's memory of a black-haired bastard in a back alley. Every thread ran down and knotted fast, and only then would they move. Stannis ground his teeth and agreed, because it was correct, and he could no more argue with a correct thing than fly. He retreated to his island to wait, chafing at every day of delay, as though it were a personal cowardice, counting the hours until an old man's caution had at last run its course, telling no one, trusting no one, because that too was simply who he was. And Jon Arryn, out of time, and very nearly out of allies, sat down to write one final letter to the only other honest man he had ever made. He was not quick enough. Pycelle, who missed very little and reported all of it, whispered to the queen that the hand had lately been spending his days among the books of lineage. An old man's harmless hobby, surely, he added, watching her face to see whether she agreed. She did not answer him, which was answer enough. Cersei did not hesitate. She never had, not once in her life, when her children were the steak on the table. Jon Arryn took ill at supper. It came on him slowly, then all at once, a chill in the gut, a trembling in the hands, a fog rolling in over a mind that had steered the realm for 20 years. In 4 days he was dead, and the Grand Maester called it a chill settled on the stomach, and shook his old head sadly, and only one man in the whole of the realm would have known to call it by another name. His last clear act, in a brief hour when the fog lifted, was to press a small sealed letter into the hand of a household guard he trusted. "Ride north," he told him, gripping the man's wrist with the last of his strength. "Into the north. Put this into Eddard Stark's own hand and no other man's, and do not stop for anything on the road." 6 weeks later, in the quiet of his solar, with the snow drifting past the window, Ned Stark turned a small sealed roll over in his fingers and felt his chest go tight, because he knew the seal. He had not seen it since he was a boy in the Vale, learning at this dead man's knee how to become a man. He broke it. Inside, in a hand gone shaky at the very last, were 3 words and nothing else. "The seed is strong." He did not need a book of lineages. He had the book living beneath his own roof, and he had been reading it every night at supper for 5 years, without once letting himself understand a single page of it. Ned sat at the head of his hall that evening and did the thing he had never permitted himself to do. He looked. He made himself look. Every Baratheon he had known in the whole of his life had been black of hair. Robert, Stannis, Renly, the entire broad-shouldered, raven-headed brood of them, back and back through the years. And there, at his own table, sat 3 children of the sun, gold from crown to heel, not one dark hair among the 3 of them. Afterward, he found Maester Luwin bent over his ledgers and asked him, idle as a man asking after tomorrow's weather, how the color of a child's hair came down from its mother and father, whether a dark old house bred true. Luwin, forever delighted to be asked anything at all, laid it out in 4 unhurried sentences. That in the marriages of the great houses, the black of a strong ancient line very nearly always overbore the gold or the red. that a raven-haired father and a golden mother would, near every time, get raven-haired children. He had not the faintest notion in the world what he had just confirmed, and he returned to his sums well content, and Ned Stark walked out of the room with the floor gone soft as marsh beneath his boots. He walked the walls of Winterfell the whole of that night, and did the arithmetic over and over, and there was no answer anywhere in it that a man could build a life behind. If he spoke, if he did the one thing Eddard Stark had always done, the thing that was the whole marrow of who he was, then Robert would kill them. Not Cersei alone, Joffrey, for whom Ned had dug a grave with his own hands and taught to save a litter of dying pups. Myrcella, who had hugged his knees at the harvest feast and asked him whether wolves were kind. Tommen, who was 7. And then the rock would rise for its murdered blood, and the Reach would have to choose between its king and the boy Loras Tyrell called brother, and Dorne would stir, and the Riverlands, and the whole warm, bound-together realm he had spent 7 quiet years stitching, would tear straight down the center, and the tearing would be his own doing. And if he held his tongue, he let a lie sit the Iron Throne and wear a crown and be called king, and every hard, true thing Eddard Stark had ever believed about himself would slowly, quietly become a story he used to tell. He was 50 years old. In all those years, the world had asked a great deal of him and taken more. And always he had known the shape of the right thing, even as it cost him everything he had. Not once had anyone ever made him choose between his honor and the very thing his honor had always been for. Dawn found him still on the battlements. It found Joffrey, too. The boy came up the steps in the gray first light with a practice sword slung across his back. 11 years old, awake early for the yard, because that was what Ned Stark had taught him a man did with his mornings. He saw the Lord of Winterfell standing gray-faced and unmoving at the parapet, and his brow creased with something that was, unmistakably, worry. "My lord, you've been up here all night." A pause, and then lower. "Are you unwell?" Ned looked at him. He looked at the boy he had built, with his own 2 hands across 7 hard years, out of the cruel small creature Cersei had sent north to him. A boy who rose at dawn, who fed the dogs before he fed himself, who stood here now fretting over a tired old man on a cold wall. He opened his mouth to say the true thing, whatever in the 7 hells the true thing even was, and found that he could not make it come. Not to that face. "Only tired," Ned said. Joffrey nodded, plainly relieved, told him he ought to go and rest, and went on down the steps toward the yard, with his sword across his back, and the whole gold lie of him catching the first clean light of the morning. Ned Stark stood alone on the wall and understood, with a clarity that would not leave him again for the rest of his days, that he had just told his first lie, and that it had been easy. For 4 months Ned Stark held his tongue, and every day of it he told himself the same thing, that he was waiting for proof. Proof he did not need. Proof that would change nothing. Proof that was only the name he had learned to give his own cowardice. The little letter with 3 words in it sat locked in a drawer he did not open, and the winter turned slowly toward spring, and 1,000 miles south, the thing that would decide it for him was already fat and drunk and calling for his horse. Cersei, when it came, felt almost cheated. She had turned the possibility over in her mind for years. The doctored wine, the pliant squire, the hunt that a clever woman might arrange. She had needed none of it. Robert had spent the better part of a decade growing fat and bored and estranged from a golden son who wrote his letters to Eddard Stark and never once to his own father, and he rode into the Kingswood that morning already deep in his cups, because drink and boredom were the whole of what Robert Baratheon had become. The boar did the rest. They carried him back to the Red Keep opened from hip to breastbone, and he lived 4 days on milk of the poppy, and shouted for Ned Stark twice in his fever, and for no one else at all. There was no plot to trace, no thread that any careful man might one day pull loose, and Cersei found, standing over the wreck of her husband, that the gods had done her work for her, and left her nothing whatever to feel clever about. The message reached Winterfell in 9 days. Ned read it in the middle of the training yard, because that was where the rider ran him to ground, and there was no dignified way to withdraw somewhere private with the whole castle watching. 10 feet off, Joffrey was working through his forms with a practice blade, quick and precise, the way Sir Roderick had beaten it into him, and did not look up. It had to be Ned who told him. There was no one else it could fall to, and Ned Stark had never once in his life been good at this. He crossed the yard, set a hand on the boy's shoulder, and said it plainly, because plain was the only way he had. Your father is dead. A boar in the Kingswood. It was quick. Joffrey lowered the sword. He was 12 years old. He had not laid eyes on Robert Baratheon since he was 6, and he did not know how to grieve a man who had been, the whole of his remembered life, a name at the foot of a letter and a seal upon a decree. He waited for the grief to come. It did not come, and something in his face flinched at the shame of that he could not feel the thing a son was supposed to feel. He looked up at Ned, and the only question in his head came out of him small and bare. What happens now? That evening, the great hall of Winterfell was full and silent. They all knew. There was nothing left to announce. The boy sat where he always sat, among them and not above them. And no one had been told what to do, because nothing in the customs of the North covered the moment a king was made at your own supper table. Robb Stark stood first, 15 years old, with the instincts of a man twice his age. He rose from the bench without a word and went down on one knee. And then Theon, who had come here a hostage and stayed to become a brother. And then Loras, and then every ward in the hall, the whole gathered future of the 7 kingdoms folding down onto the rushes before a boy they had wrestled face first into the mud 100 times. There was no calculation in it, and that was the terrible thing. Not one of them knelt for a crown. They knelt because Robb knelt, and Robb knelt because the boy who had wept in his kennels and stood at his shoulder in the yard for 6 years was suddenly, impossibly, alone at the top of the world. And a brother does not leave a brother to stand up there by himself. It was loyalty, plain and unbought, the exact thing Eddard Stark had spent his life teaching them, and it was about to crown a lie. Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, looked out over a hall of kneeling friends. Then he looked past every one of them to the one man still standing at the high table. Ned Stark stood there. The 3 words were locked in a drawer 3 floors above his head. Robert was 9 days dead. Here was the moment, the last clean one, the only one that would ever come this cheaply. To say it, before a crown, before a war, before the boy became a king, and the lie became the law of the land. 3 heartbeats he stood, and in those 3 heartbeats the whole future of Westeros hung upon whether one man would open his mouth. Then Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, went down on one knee to a lie. They rode south together, and it was the strangest procession the 7 kingdoms had ever seen. A Baratheon king rode at the heart of it, escorted to his own crowning by a Stark and a Greyjoy, by 2 Tyrells and a Martell, by his own Lannister brother and sister, the assembled heirs of every great house in Westeros traveling as a single household, because that was, in plain fact, what 6 years under one roof had made of them. There were no hostages in the column, and no factions in it. There were only young people who had grown up in the same yard, riding to watch one of their own take a throne. Every lord who came out to the King's Road to see it pass understood the same thing in the same breath, and not one of them said it aloud, that there would be no war over this succession. There could not be. There was no one left in all the realm to raise a banner against, for every house that might have fought had a child in that column, laughing at the boy king's side. Ned rode at the head of it, and with every mile he felt less like the hand of a king and more like a man escorting his own crime, under guard, the whole way to its coronation. Word ran ahead of them down the King's Road faster than the column could travel it. In every holdfast and market town the story arrived first as rumor and hardened into fact by the time the outriders came into view. The whole of the realm's blood rides as one, and the wolf leads them.
Ever practical men of coin, the merchants along the road did their sums and stopped hoarding grain against a war they now knew would never come.
Sellswords who had drifted toward King's Landing on the scent of a disputed succession turned around and drifted away again, because there was no seam here to sell a sword into. A realm that had spent 300 years learning to expect a war over every dead king looked at the boy in the middle of that column and simply exhaled.
Cersei met them at the gates of King's Landing. 6 years she had counted the days for this. 6 years of letters burned unanswered, of a son carried off to the cold end of the world. And she came out to the gate with her heart in her mouth and reached for her boy. Her boy was not there. He embraced her, yes. Joffrey came down off his horse and put his arms about her, and was kind about it, courteous, warm, entirely correct, in exactly the way a well-raised young man embraces an aunt he has not seen since he was small and cannot altogether place. There was no fire in it. There was no need for it at all. He held her the way one holds a stranger he has been told all his life to love, and then he stepped back and turned to Eddard Stark to ask, in the easy tone of a boy consulting the one man whose judgment he actually trusted, what Lord Stark made of the honor guard. She searched his face for the child she had knelt to in the snow 6 years ago, the one she had told he was a lion, the one she had promised to come for. She had come for him every month for a decade, in ink across 1,000 miles, and the boy looking back at her now was polite and healthy and a stranger, and he had already turned his attention to a question of northern soldiery because the Stark had not yet answered him. Cersei stood at the gate of her city with her arms still half lifted. Whatever moved across her face in that moment was the most terrible thing any man saw on the whole of that journey. She had won. She had her son's crown, her son's city, her son handed back to her at last, and she had lost her son, wholly and forever, and she knew down to the marrow whose hands had taken him from her. The coronation was set, and the realm assembled to see.
They came from every corner, Highgarden and the Rock, Sunspear and the Twins, the whole of Westeros pouring into King's Landing to watch a boy they broadly approved of set a crown upon his own head without a single sword drawn in anger. Every great house sent its lord, every house but one. From Dragonstone there came no lord, no letter, no excuse, and no word of apology. Stannis Baratheon simply was not there, and offered nothing as to why. Most of the court never marked the absence at all. Stannis had never been a man whose company was missed, but Ned Stark marked it, and Ned Stark read the shape of that silence better than any living man, because he alone knew what Stannis had spent the last year of his life reading in the archives beneath the Red Keep. He stood in the great sept of Baelor, among the lords of the realm, and watched the High Septon lower a crown onto a head of gold. And across the narrow sea, on a black island of stone, a fleet was already being counted, ship by ship, by a man who did not care in the least that he stood alone. The letters went out from Dragonstone within the moon, one to every lord in the 7 kingdoms, and they were meticulous. Stannis had spent a year assembling the thing, and it showed. The lineage traced back 3 centuries. The black hair is marked in every generation. The plain and damning arithmetic, set down with a clerk's cold care, every word of it true. And it landed across the realm with an audible thud of indifference. The lords did not read it as a claim.
They read it as an accusation, an ugly, poisonous accusation against a boy their own sons had grown up beside, leveled by a sour man not one of them had ever liked. At Highgarden, Mace Tyrell read it aloud at his own table and laughed out loud, because Loras was sitting 3 seats down and had called the king his brother since he was a child. In Sunspear, Doran Martell read it once, thought carefully about what a war over it would do to Trystane, and slid it quietly into a drawer.
At River Run, and at the Twins, and in 100 lesser halls, men who had sent their own children north weighed the letter for exactly as long as it took to remember that their heir wrote home fondly of the Golden King, and then they threw it on the fire. Not one of them stopped to ask whether it was true. That was the genius of the thing Robert had built without meaning to, and the curse of the thing Stannis carried without wanting it. In a realm where every lord's child slept under the same roof as the accused, the truth of the accusation had ceased to matter at all. What mattered was that no one wished it true, and so it was not. A truth that no one wishes to be true is not a sword. It is only a letter, and letters can be set aside. Stannis was no fool. He knew there was exactly one man in the realm whose word could turn it. One man the whole of Westeros knew to be incapable of a lie. The other son, Jon Arryn, had raised, the hand who now stood at the boy king's right hand. If Eddard Stark said it was true, then it was true, and the realm would have no choice but to reckon with it. So Stannis sent Davos Seaworth north by ship with a private letter, and that letter neither threatened nor bargained. It asked only that Ned Stark confirm what Stannis knew he already knew. Ned read it alone in his chambers in the Tower of the Hand. He thought of Myrcella, who had once asked him whether wolves were kind. He thought of Tommen, who was 7. He thought of a filthy boy weeping in the kennels at dawn over a single dead pup, because he had saved 6 of the litter and could not save the 7th. He thought too of Jon Arryn, dead of a truth exactly this size, and of the fact that the man who had raised them both to be honest had spent his last strength trying to hand this same ruin to him. Then he took up his pen and wrote back 4 lines in his own plain hand, saying that he had seen no evidence of any such thing, and that he counseled Lord Stannis most strongly against ever repeating it. He read the 4 lines over once before he sealed them, and did not recognize the hand that had written them as his own. Davos Seaworth had been waiting in an antechamber for the answer, and he read Ned's face long before he read the letter. He was a smuggler by trade and a blunt man by nature, and he had known a great many liars in his time. He said what he saw with a smuggler's rough kindness. "I've known liars, my lord, clever ones, frightened ones, all kinds." He tucked the sealed letter into his coat without breaking it. "Not one of them ever looked as sick as you look right now." He waited a moment, in case the Lord wished to unsay anything, the way a decent man leaves a door open behind him. "My master doesn't want a war. He wants to be right, and to have someone say so. That's all he's ever wanted. It's a small thing to want, and it's ruined his whole life." Ned said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would not have been worse. Davos sailed. Stannis broke the seal, read 4 lines, and understood that he now stood entirely alone against the whole of the 7 kingdoms, with nothing in his hands but the truth, which had proven to be the most worthless thing a man could own. And that same month, a ship came into Dragonstone out of the east, and a woman in red walked down onto the black stone and sought out the bitter, righteous, abandoned man at the cold heart of his empty fortress, and told him she had seen him in the flames. Cersei had assumed she would rule. Her son was a boy of 12 with a crown too large for his head. Of course the Queen Mother would guide his hand, hold the regency, speak through him until he was grown. It was the natural order of things, and she had waited 6 bitter years to claim it. Joffrey did not appoint her regent. He appointed no regent at all. He named Eddard Stark his hand, and Tywin Lannister his master of coin, a division so exact that Tywin, reading the decree at the rock, could not decide whether to be furious or quietly proud. The boy had set the 2 most powerful men in the realm to check one another, and kept the balance in his own small fist. It was the move of a ruler 3 times his years. It was, though no one in King's Landing knew to name it, pure Winterfell. And every time Cersei leaned in to whisper at her son's ear, a word against the Stark, a warning, a poison she had been distilling patiently for a decade, she met the same thing: courteous attention, immovable patience, a wall, polite and total, that offered her nothing whatsoever to push against. She had felt that wall before, years ago, in the person of the man who built it, and now it lived inside her own child. Slowly, and then all at once, Cersei understood that she had raised nothing. Every part of the boy she loved had been taken down to the foundations and rebuilt by another man's hands. So she reached for the one weapon Eddard Stark could never take from her. She got Joffrey alone. No hand, no guards, no wall between them. And she told him, not Robert's son. Never once was Robert's son. Jaime's. Hers. Wholly and only hers. Blood of the rock through and through. Every crown he wore and every kindness the North had ever shown him had been lavished on a boy who did not exist. A Baratheon who was no Baratheon. A lie wrapped in golden skin. She took his face in her hands the way she had in the snow 6 years before, and told him that the Starks had known, that they must have known, that every cold gray one of them had looked at his golden head across their supper table and said nothing, and let him believe he was theirs to shape. She said it as a mother reaching across a chasm for a child she had lost. She believed with everything in her that once he understood he was truly hers, that the North had built its good, decent king on a foundation of her secret, he would need her again, and the wall would come down, and she would have her son back. For one moment it nearly worked. She saw it cross his face, the doubt, the cold arithmetic of hair and blood, the memory of Ned Stark standing too long over a library tapestry one harvest night years ago. For one moment the boy wavered on the edge of becoming the thing she wanted, and Cersei's breath caught, because she thought she had him. Joffrey did not scream. He did not weep, nor call for a headsman, nor do a single one of the ugly things the small child Cersei remembered would have done. He went white. He went very still. And then, 12 years old and shaking, he walked the length of the Red Keep straight to the Tower of the Hand and asked the only man he had ever wholly trusted whether it was true, and swore, before Ned could so much as draw breath, that he would take whatever answer he was given and never question it, that he needed only to hear it from the one person in all the world who did not lie. Ned Stark looked at his king, at his ward, at the boy he had raised up out of a monster, who stood now in his doorway begging for the truth and promising to build his life upon it. "No," Ned said, "it is not true." And Joffrey believed him, completely, in an instant, because Eddard Stark did not lie. Everyone in Westeros knew it. It was the very first thing anyone learned of the man, and the boy walked out of that room lighter than he had ever been in the whole of his life, unburdened of the cruelest thing his mother had ever said to him, restored to himself. Behind him, the door swung shut, and Ned Stark sat alone in the Tower of the Hand, amid the wreckage of 40 years spent being the one man in the realm who would never do the thing he had just done. He did not have her killed. Ned Stark's boy did not send a headsman for his own mother. The thought seems never to have taken shape in him at all. But he had been trained across 6 patient years to see a problem plainly and to act upon it. And the problem, as he understood it, was a woman who had looked her king in the eye and tried to poison his crown with a monstrous lie about his own birth. So he confined her. Cersei Lannister was taken from court and sent under escort to Casterly Rock, there to remain in comfort and dignity to the end of her days. Her retirement, explained to the realm as an illness of the mind that left her unfit for the strain of the capital. It was done calmly, competently, without cruelty, and without appeal. And everyone who had known Joffrey as a small, screaming child watched it happen with a quiet horror they could not quite put a name to. Tywin Lannister did not object. He could not. To object was to invite the question of precisely what Cersei had said to earn such a sentence. And that was the one question Tywin Lannister would carry to his grave, sealed shut. He came to King's Landing, looked at the grandson who had exiled his daughter with a decree as clean as any he himself had ever written, and found that for the first time in his life he was in a room with someone he could neither buy, frighten, nor outthink. A boy who wanted nothing from him, and could not be threatened without threatening 3 Lannister children in the bargain. He went home to the Rock. He did not write to Cersei. There was nothing to say that the walls of her own castle would not now say to her every day for the rest of her life. And Jaime, standing against the wall of the throne room in his white Kingsguard cloak, watched his son send his sister into exile for the crime of telling the truth, and held his tongue, because every word he might have spoken cost 3 lives, and his own weighed nothing at all against them. He had killed a king to save a city once, and been called Kingslayer for it ever after. Now he stood at rigid attention, and said nothing to save 2 children and a woman he had loved his whole life. And there was no name for that, and no one would ever know he had done it. Ned watched the whole of it from the hand's place at the foot of the throne, and understood at last exactly what he had made. He had not saved the boy from cruelty. That was the lie he had been telling himself for 6 years, digging graves and whelping pups, and drilling a monster into a man. What he had done, in cold fact, was take a cruel child and give him discipline, competence, judgment, and iron resolve, and then hand him a reason to be ruthless and the training to be very, very good at it. Joffrey was no monster now. Joffrey was a decent, capable, level-headed young king who had just calmly destroyed his own mother in defense of a lie that Eddard Stark had set in his mouth with his own 2 hands. Every instinct Ned had trained into the boy had worked. Every last one. That was the whole horror of it. Not that the teaching had failed, but that it had succeeded flawlessly. And this was what flawless success looked like from the inside. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon reached the end of his patience with the whole of the South. The realm would not give him the throne that was his by every law of gods and men. Very well then. He was finished asking. But there was another duty in the world besides a crown, an older duty and a colder one. And if Westeros would not have him for its king, nothing under the sky could stop him from being its shield. He had heard the things the woman in red said of a war gathering in the far north, and he had spent the whole of his life believing that a man goes where the duty is, whether or not a single soul ever thinks to thank him for it. He took his fleet north, not to the wall to sulk at the end of the world, but to the wall to serve, to the one place in all of Westeros where being right and being alone were not disqualifications, but the very heart of the work. 2 years passed. The realm ruled itself well and quietly under a good young king and his honest hand, and forgot the sour uncle at the edge of the map. And then, out of Castle Black, Stannis Baratheon sent the 7 kingdoms a letter. It made no claim and named no king. It opened with the only 4 words that would ever turn the whole of the realm north at once. The dead are coming. 2 years of good, quiet, prosperous rule, and then a raven from the end of the world laid 4 words on the small council table and dared anyone to laugh. Someone did. The council received Stannis Baratheon's warning exactly as it would have received any raving from a bitter exile gone to sulk at the wall, with the weary patience men keep for a madman they are obliged to hear out. Baelish was the gentlest, and therefore the deadliest. He observed, turning his cup, that a man who had once written to the whole of the realm, claiming the king was a bastard, was perhaps not the soundest authority on what was and was not coming for them out of the dark. A man who will say one impossible thing, he murmured, will say another. The council murmured its agreement. Grand Maester Pycelle spoke gravely of grumpkins and snarks and the credulity of northern smallfolk. A Redwine wondered aloud whether the whole letter was a ploy to draw the realm's swords north so that some rival could move in the south. Every man at that table had a reason ready to hand for why the thing on the parchment could not possibly be true, and each of the reasons was really the same reason. They did not wish it to be. And Joffrey, 16 now, and 6 years a king, did the thing he always did when a matter's weight outran his own certainty. He turned to his hand.
Ned Stark had spent the whole of his life listening to old Nan's stories, and the whole of his life knowing Stannis Baratheon, and in neither had he ever once known Stannis to exaggerate a single thing. He laid his hands flat upon the table. "I believe him," he said quietly. And that was all. That was the entire crisis, undone in a sentence. Because Ned Stark said it, Joffrey believed it. Because Joffrey believed it, Robb Stark believed it, and Loras Tyrell, and Theon Greyjoy, and Trystane Martell, the whole gathered generation that had grown up treating the word of Eddard Stark as the one fixed point in a turning world. And because they believed it, the Reach believed it, and the Iron Islands, and Dorne, and the North, each great house swinging to follow its own child's certainty like a needle to the lodestone. A warning that in another colder life would have taken 4 years and 5 broken armies to be heard, took 9 days.
Tywin Lannister, master of coin, was instructed to open the treasury and fund a war against a children's tale. He did it. He thought it madness, and he did it without a word of protest, because the king, his grandson, had asked him to, in front of witnesses, and because 3 of his own grandchildren stood in the room when the asking was done, and there was no move left anywhere on the board that did not run straight through them. Alone afterward, the old lion turned the thing over and could find no flaw in his own helplessness. He had spent 40 years teaching the realm to fear the debts it owed Casterly Rock. He had never once imagined a debt running the other way. A boy who owed him nothing, wanted nothing, and could not be threatened without threatening Tywin's own blood in the bargain. He signed the orders. There was nothing else a rich man could do. Within the year, the greatest host ever assembled in the history of Westeros was moving north up the King's Road beneath a single banner. It existed for one reason, and the reason was absurd. Because a homesick drunk had missed the Vale 30 years before and turned his grief into a decree, and bound a realm so tightly together by accident that it could now do in a single season what it had never once managed in 300 years. Move as one thing, in one direction, toward one enemy, without a single lord pausing to reckon what advantage he might wring from his neighbors turned back. Ned rode at his king's side through the gates of Winterfell at the head of the whole realm, and for the space of 1 hour, watching that river of banners pour into his own yard, he was almost able to believe the lie had been worth it. Then they rode on to Castle Black, and Stannis Baratheon was standing in the yard, waiting, gaunt and grey, and entirely unsurprised to see them. He looked straight past the Golden King he had every right in the world to hate, past the boy, past the crown, past all of it, and fixed his eyes on the one man who had made him what he now was. "Lord Stark," said Stannis, "we have unfinished business." He did not shout. Stannis Baratheon had never once in his life needed to shout. The truth, spoken flat, did all the work he ever asked of it.
Alone with Ned in the cold stone of the king's tower, he laid out the account item by item, the way a steward reads a ledger aloud to a lord who owes far more than he can ever pay. His claim? Gone. His name? Made a byword for bitterness, a thing lords laughed at over their suppers. 3 years of his one life spent at the frozen end of the world among murderers and rapers who had cut their way to the wall, because it was the last ground in all of Westeros where a man could be entirely right and believed by no one and still have honest work to do.
And the worst of it, the thing Stannis set down last and heaviest, was that he had been right the entire time, about the whole of it. And one man's refusal to speak a single word had rendered being right worth precisely nothing. He did not spare himself in the telling either. He said flatly that he had wanted the throne, that a part of him had wanted it badly, had counted the rivets on the Iron Throne in his dreams, and that this made no difference to the arithmetic, because a thing that is true, whether the man who says it profits by it or not. That, more than anything, was the shape of Stannis Baratheon. He would indict himself in the same cold breath he used to indict you, and weight both charges exactly the same. Ned did not defend himself. There was no defense, and in any case, Stannis had never had the least interest in hearing one. A defense was only a man arguing with arithmetic, and Stannis did not argue with sums. And then he did the thing that made him, in his cold and graceless way, magnificent. He set it aside, not forgave. Stannis did not forgive. Forgiveness was a softness that belonged to septons and summer children, but set it down deliberately, the way a man sets down a tool he fully means to take up again the moment the work allows. The dead were 8 leagues north. The boy with the false crown had brought 100,000 men up the King's Road, an army that Stannis, rightful king of all Westeros, could not have raised on his best day with his truest claim in his fist. There was a use for such an army, and it was the only use that had ever truly mattered. When this is done, Stannis told him, the realm will hear it. From my own mouth, before all of them, and you will stand at my side while it does, and you will not look away. He turned back to the map spread on the table. Until then, my sword is his, not for him, for the wall. Ned had not yet found an answer when the gate horn sounded, twice the call for rangers coming in, and the whole tower spilled out into the yard to see who had ridden back out of the Deadlands alive. 11 men came in out of 40. At their head rode Jon Snow. 4 years a brother of the night's watch, 4 years ranging beyond the wall, while the warm south forgot he had ever drawn breath. Jon Snow swung down off his garron in front of his father and his half-brothers, and a king he had last seen as a small golden boy swinging a wooden sword in a training yard. He had spent those 4 years doing the single thing no lord in the south had thought worth doing. He had learned the enemy, what they were, how they moved, which of them could be killed with fire, and which only with dragonglass or Valyrian steel, how a village died and rose, how many nights a man had before the cold behind his own eyes stopped being cold, and, packed hard into the saddlebags at his knee, he had brought the answer south with him. He gave his report standing, plainly, sparing them nothing, to the men who would build the whole of the war upon it. When Joffrey asked him, quietly, how long they had, Jon Snow looked at the king he did not know, and said he did not think in days any more. He thought in leagues, and the leagues were closing. And behind him, far to the north, above the black, jagged line of the haunted forest, the sky had begun to go white. Everything the Winterfell Academy had ever been for was spent in a single night, and for the first few hours of it, it very nearly looked like enough. The battle plan unfolded with a coordination no army in the history of the Seven Kingdoms had ever managed, and the reason for it was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Robb's vanguard fell back precisely on Loras's timing, not because a courier carried the order through the dark, but because Robb Stark had trusted Loras Tyrell since the two of them were 9 years old and wrestling in the mud. Theon's ships held the frozen eastern coast the whole night through, because Theon Greyjoy would sooner have drowned in the grey water than be remembered as the man who let the line break. Trystane's Dornish spears held the western flank without once bending, because Myrcella was behind that flank, and Trystane had long since stopped pretending there was any hell he would not hold for her. Jon Snow put dragonglass into the hands of 100,000 men in 6 days. No one argued the distribution. No one held a blade back to bargain with later. There was no jockeying, no lord quietly hedging his own strength so as to be the last man standing once the neighbors had bled themselves white. None of the 1,000 small betrayals that had lost every other great war in the long history of Westeros. It was the single most efficient thing the realm had ever done. And it was not enough. They lost the wall. 8,000 years it had stood, and it came down in a night. And behind it poured a tide that did not tire, and did not break, and did not fear. They lost Castle Black, they lost the Gift, and the Umber lands, and the last long miles of the north, and they lost 30,000 men, who rose again within the hour, wearing the same faces they had died in, and turned their blades on the men they had shared bread with the evening before. The host fell back on Winterfell in a fighting retreat that took 3 weeks and paid for every mile of it in blood. It cost them Sir Roderick Cassel, who had run the training yard where half the realm first learned to hold a sword, cut down covering the crossing at the last river. It cost them Greywind, who died with his teeth locked in the throat of a thing that was already dead. It cost Theon Greyjoy his left hand, sheared off clean at the wrist by a blade of black ice. And Theon laughed about it after, through his teeth, because a Greyjoy does not weep where the Ironborn can see him do it. And through all 3 weeks of it, Joffrey the First fought in the rear guard, the most murderous place in the whole retreating column, because Eddard Stark had told him once, in a training yard a lifetime ago, that a king who will not stand in the line has no business asking any other man to. At the Weeping Water, it nearly cost him everything. His horse went down on the ice, and a dead man with a Karstark face closed a hand on his ankle and dragged him under the churn of the retreat. And for 3 heartbeats, the King of the 7 Kingdoms was on his back in the red slush, watching a frozen blade come down. It was Robb who reached him, Robb who had trusted him and been trusted since they were boys, hauling him up out of the press by the collar with a curse that no man says to a king. Joffrey came up, bleeding from the scalp, and did not leave the line. It was the first time in the whole of the boy's life that his education showed plain and clean and good, with nothing at all tangled up inside it. On the last night before Winterfell, with the dead a single day's march behind, and the odds no longer worth pretending about, Stannis Baratheon walked into the king's tent and did the thing he had promised to do. He did it because a man might well die on the morrow, and a lie must never be permitted to outlive the both of them. He told Joffrey everything, flatly and in order, the book of lineages, the black hair in every Baratheon for 300 years, Jon Arryn, Cersei, Jaime, the whole of it, sparing nothing, softening nothing, because Stannis Baratheon had never softened a truth in his life, and was not about to learn the trick of it on the eve of the end of the world. And then he gave the boy the last piece, the one cut to wound deepest, because to leave it out would have been a mercy, and Stannis did not deal in those. "Lord Stark is known since you were 11 years old," he said. "Ask him." Joffrey did not come to Ned in fury. That was the thing that would haunt Eddard Stark longer than any accusation ever could have. He found him in the armory, a little before midnight, with the dead close enough now that you could hear them riding the wind. And he did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for a blade. He asked a single question, quietly, in almost the same small voice he had once used to ask, "What happens now? Did you make me good because you believed in me? A pause, and the boy's voice did not shake, which was worse than if it had. Or because you already knew what I was, and you needed me to be worth the lie? Ned Stark opened his mouth and found that he could not answer. Not because the answer was too cruel to speak, because he did not have it. He had never once known himself which of the two it had been. Not for a single day of the 6 years he had spent shaping the boy out of the ruin Cersei had sent him. The two things had lived side by side inside him the whole time, and he had been careful, always, never to ask which of them was holding up the roof. The silence stretched and filled the little stone room and became the only answer he had to give. Joffrey nodded once, as though a small matter had been quietly settled. Then he put on his helm and went out to command a battle for a realm that was not his and did not look back. Jon Snow's plan asked one impossible thing of them: that the Night King himself be drawn down into the godswood of Winterfell. And the Night King would come down only for something worth the coming. So they gave him a king, Joffrey Baratheon, who was no Baratheon, who knew it now, who had known it for 11 hours, planted the golden stag banner beneath the heart tree with his own 2 hands, and stood beneath it in the red-lit dark with 300 men, and held. He held because a king who will not stand in the line has no business asking anyone else to, and it did not seem to matter to him in the least any longer whose son he was. The lesson had gone in deeper than the blood had ever reached. Loras Tyrell died at his shoulder in the 2nd hour of it. A White's frozen hand locked around his sword arm, and half a smile still on his face. And Joffrey was not given even the time to grieve the only friend he had ever made before the next wave came over the roots. And Stannis Baratheon, who had every reason under heaven to stand back and let the false king fall, to let the dead do the thing the realm never would, and hand him a crown over the boy's cooling body, fought his way through the press to that banner instead, and held the left of it, and went on holding it until they dragged him down into the bones. He did it because his duty had never once been to the boy. It had been to the realm, and to the living, and Stannis Baratheon had never, in the whole of his hard life, confused the two. And the Night King came. He came exactly as Jon Snow had said he would, walking down through the shattered godswood toward the one bright banner still standing. His lieutenants of blue-eyed ice ranged close around him, and every living eye in the north was fixed upon the boy king's last stand beneath the heart tree, which was precisely and exactly why not one of them saw the small figure that had lain folded into the branches of the weirwood for 6 silent hours drop down out of the red leaves at his back. Arya Stark had never once in her life been where anyone expected her to be. No one counted her. No one ever had. That was the whole of what made her deadly, and it was the last thing the Night King ever failed to notice. The dragon glass went in at the base of his skull, and the dead fell. They fell in a wave from the godswood outward, 10,000 at a time, folding to bone and dust across the whole broken length of the north, all the way back to the fallen wall. And then there was silence, sudden and total and enormous, the first true silence in 3 weeks. Ned Stark came into the godswood over a carpet of shattered bone, calling a name he did not dare hope to hear answered, and found 3 things waiting for him in the stillness. His daughter, alive, standing over a stain in the snow with a black blade in her small fist. His king, on his knees beneath the stag banner with Loras Tyrell gathered dead into his arms, not weeping, only holding him. And Stannis Baratheon, the one man in the whole of this story who had ever told the truth, whatever it cost, whenever it was asked of him, lying dead in the trampled snow with the account between them still unsettled, and now unsettlable forever. The dawn came as Jon Snow had promised it would, and it came up over a realm that had won. Stannis was dead. Cersei was rotting behind the golden walls of Casterly Rock, mad now in truth, or near enough, mother to a king who would never once send for her. Jaime Lannister would go to his grave in his white cloak, having never spoken a word. And on Dragonstone there lived a shy, gray-scaled girl named Shireen Baratheon, Stannis' daughter, the last true-born stag in all the world, who did not know, and might well never know, that she was the rightful heir to a throne 1,000 miles from her nursery, which left the truth living in exactly 2 heads in all of Westeros, and one of them wore the crown. Ned Stark went to his king and offered, at the last, to say it, to stand in the yard of Winterfell before the whole assembled realm and speak the thing plainly and take whatever came of it, the block included. He meant it, entirely and without reservation, and it was the first wholly honest thing Eddard Stark had done in 5 long years, and it had come 5 years too late to be worth anything at all but the quieting of his own conscience. Joffrey forbade it, not out of ambition. The crown meant nothing to him now, less than nothing. He had buried the only friend he ever had beneath a heart tree, and would have traded every stone of the Red Keep to have him back for an hour. He forbade it because the realm had just laid 100,000 men in the frozen ground, and a people carrying that much grief cannot also be made to bear the knowledge that the king they bled for was a lie from the first day of his reign. He had done the arithmetic. He had done it exactly the way he had been taught to do it, on a cold wall, by a man who counted the cost of a truth before ever he let himself speak it. He named Shireen Baratheon his heir, and took no wife, and let the line die clean and childless with him. And then he said the thing that closed the argument forever, without heat, looking his hand full in the face. You taught me that a man weighs the cost before he tells the truth. A beat. You didn't mean to teach me that one, but you did. Ned Stark rode north not long after, having won the war, saved the realm, held the peace, and kept alive every child he loved, and having nothing left at all of the single thing he had ever actually been. A year on, King Joffrey I, the false king, the good king, the last and best of Winterfell's wards, set his seal to the one law of his reign that would still be taught in the Maester's halls 300 years after every other thing he ever did had gone to dust. He made the great unity fostering permanent, not a decree for a season, nor for a single generation, but a standing law in perpetuity. Every child of every great house sent north to Winterfell in the year they turned 6, forever, world without end. He proclaimed it in Robert Baratheon's name, and the whole realm read sentiment into it. A good son honoring the father he had lost too young. It was not sentimental. It was a man who understood, better than anyone then living, exactly what a single lie could cost a kingdom, taking the one institution he had ever seen make men refuse to lie to one another, make them brothers first and rivals never, and welding it into the very bones of the realm so that no king who came after him could ever pry it loose again. And in his solar at Winterfell, with the snow falling soft and gray past the glass, Eddard Stark read the proclamation through to its end and understood, with the terrible clarity that had never once left him since a dawn on the battlements years before, precisely what had just been done to him. His greatest failure, the lie he had told, the man he had unmade himself in order to become, had just been carved into the law of the land in perpetuity, forever, by a boy who had every right in the world to hate him, and had chosen instead to forgive him. It was the harshest sentence anyone could ever have handed down, and the boy had not even known that he was passing it world to hate him, and had chosen instead to forgive him. It was the harshest sentence anyone could ever have handed down, and the boy had not even known that he was passing it.